Hey, everybody, welcome to my backyard again. You can see the woods behind me. So here we go. We're going to talk about the next two little content bursts here to help introduce you to the topic we're doing. You might hear my dog barking in the background. That's Jim. Jim is a jerk. He's a great dog, but he's stuck in his crate right now because I can't trust him out here by himself. So we want to talk today about two different things: the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, so like how they started, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the Boston Massacre, which is what you're going to dive into over the next couple of days in here with the Boston Massacre primary resources stuff. So if you remember, way back when on Friday, Thursday, we were talking all about how tensions have been growing, right? Ever since the French and Indian War, the British Parliament said, hey, you need to pay your fair share. It's time for you to help us. And they passed these things called first the Stamp Act, and then things like the Townshend Acts and all these different things. And the colonists were upset because they said, like, listen, we are okay paying taxes, but we want some sort of representation in Parliament, right? So no taxation without representation. Really, what the quote probably was more along the lines of taxation without representation is tyranny, but it doesn't really flow as much. So tensions and arguments have been building for years and years and years, right? We talked about the committees of correspondence and how they coordinated efforts among the different colonies and said like who's doing what's happening. There's two other groups that I want to mention here today. There's a group called the Sons of Liberty, and the Sons of Liberty were a group of people who really they resisted the British strategy. So some of the big people you see here: Samuel Adams, up there to the left, Paul Revere, and then down on the bottom you see a guy named John Hancock. We'll also talk about one of the most famous daughters of liberty next. Now, these people, they were secret society, so like they didn't like it wasn't like you wore a T-shirt that said "Sons of Liberty." They would use like code words to help communicate. They would use those committees of correspondence, and they did things like using violence and threats of violence to intimidate the British. They would ransack the home of British officials. You could see here to the right of that picture, they would have these tar and feathering underneath these liberty trees. And tar and feathering sounds kind of funny, like haha, makes them look like a chicken, but it actually could be deadly because you could seal up the pores to the point where the body overheats, and people could die from that. So these Sons of Liberty, yeah, they were kind of they're some of our greatest forefathers, right? But some of the things they did were pretty much almost like a semi quasi illegal thing, right? But they were doing what they believed was right to resist tyranny. We also had this group of people called the Daughters of Liberty. So like the ladies could get involved too. And what they did is they really kind of supported behind the scenes. They would often support the boycott of British goods. And when we boycott, remember that means we're not buying things from them. So they would like create clothes, make clothes from home. They would find different alternatives to tea. This is when Americans' addiction to coffee starts to come up because they start to rely on coffee, not just tea. Right, so these Sons and Daughters of Liberty were resisting the colonial or the British rule for some time. They're going to talk about next week, later this week, we'll talk about the Boston Tea Party and how like their biggest single event helped lead us down this path to war. But before we get there, I want to talk about something else in Boston. And this was 3 or 4 years before the Boston Tea Party. And we say this bloody affair. It's violence in the streets of Boston, March 5th, 1770. So tensions were rising before we get to this point, right? We have the Quartering Act where soldiers were forced, or citizens were forced to put soldiers in their homes should they request it. We had these Townshend Acts already where now people were forced to pay higher goods on import or higher costs on imported goods. And a guy by the name of John Hancock there. John Hancock, we know he was a colonial leader in Britain. Boston. One of the other things that we know for sure is he was probably more than likely a smuggler. So he was bringing in illegal goods around these Townshend Acts to try and make sure that people could get things at cost cheaper, right? So hiding from the officials that way they wouldn't have to pay the taxes. So what happened was in early 1770, one of his ships was seized. It was taken by a British customs official. The customs officials are people who are there to make sure taxes are being paid. And the people in Boston were outraged, and they start to have these protests, and they start to have more troops flood into the cities of Boston. So between the time of his ship being seized and this March 5th, 1770, you see these tensions continually rising. You see like fights and close to fights all along the Boston Harbor and in the port of Boston. right? So here's what we know about the Boston, we call it this massacre, right? We know it took place March 5th, 1770. We know that there had been fights leading up to this in the previous nights. We absolutely know that there was a group of people outside of the customs house, so like the tax collector's house, both including soldiers and citizens, and we know that the word fire was said. However, we're not quite sure who gave the order to fire. Now, we also know that at the end of the night, 5 lay dead and a number lay injured. What you're going to do is you're going to start to take a look at who's to blame, right? So you have these variety of sources. You have the picture that you see on the left-hand side there is an engraving that ran in the newspapers by Paul Revere, one of the most famous Sons of Liberty. You have a painting from another guy made a few years later. You have letters. You have transcripts of the testimony when people were on trial for what happened. And we're going to determine which side, British or colonists, deserve more of the blame for Boston. So that's what you're going to do over the next few days in here. Hopefully this little content burst helped.